Sting is one of the biggest wrestlers who made the jump from WWE to AEW. He officially left WWE in May 2020, and a lot of people didn't know that he was actually signed to a WWE Legends contract. Even though he hadn't wrestled in many years, they were still selling his merchandise and things like that.
Yeah, and the main reason why Sting left the company, WWE wouldn't allow him to wrestle after his neck injury during his match against Seth Rollins.
He debuted in AEW on December 2nd, 2020, so about 6 or 7 months after his contract expired in WWE, and it was a big shock when he showed up. Now, how has Sting done since he joined AEW late last year?
I think it's been mixed results. I think for the most part, it's been somewhat of a disappointment. He's mostly been relegated as a manager for Darby Allin. He did wrestle one street fight, which was pre-recorded. Since then, Sting has done very little in AEW, and I think a lot of Sting fans are not happy about his current position in the company.
Now, Chris Jericho, he left WWE in April 2018, and he joined AEW officially in January 2019.
Yes, Chris Jericho, he was the first ever AEW World Champion, and he brought a lot of new fans to AEW. Without Chris Jericho, AEW would probably not be as successful as it is.
Now, why exactly did Chris Jericho leave WWE?
The main reason why Chris Jericho left WWE is because of the fact that at WrestleMania 33 in 2017, Chris Jericho versus Kevin Owens was put second on the card. This sent a message to Chris Jericho that Vince McMahon did not see Jericho as a main event star. So Chris Jericho went elsewhere, he went to New Japan, and eventually AEW.
Now, Chris Jericho, he was the AEW champion. He lost the title to Jon Moxley. How do you think Chris Jericho has done in AEW since losing the title?
I think for the most part, it's been successful, but I think there have been some bumps in the road. They're trying to have him put over up-and-coming wrestlers like Orange Cassidy. But now Chris Jericho is involved in one of the top feuds in AEW, as the Inner Circle feuds with the Pinnacle. Dustin Rhodes left WWE in March 2019 because he was not being used well, and he wanted to be in AEW with his brother Cody to help the company. He joined AEW in April 2019.
Now, Dustin Rhodes in AEW, he's kind of in the same position that he was in WWE before he left. He's on the lower mid-card, right?
Yes, and so far it looks like Dustin Rhodes is there just to put over younger talent.
Jon Moxley left WWE in April 2019, and this is 100% one of the most shocking jumps from WWE to AEW.
Yes, at the time, it was unbelievably shocking to have such a huge star leave for AEW.
And Jon Moxley, he debuted in AEW surprisingly at the end of a pay-per-view, and that was in May 2019. And he is one of the biggest draws. Without Jon Moxley, I don't think AEW would have the success that it's having right now. He is 100% one of the top 3 stars on the show. How do you think Jon Moxley's career in AEW has gone compared to how he was doing in WWE?
I think he's doing somewhat better to a degree. I think he's had a lot more success. At the moment, he's not exactly in the main event picture, but for the most part, Jon Moxley has had way more success now than he did in WWE.
Moxley left WWE, where he was known as Dean Ambrose, of course, and he left the company because he did not like where his character was going and how it was being used on TV, because he thought that it made him look like a joke. And he said it was some of the worst writing that he's ever experienced in his career.
Jake Hager left WWE in March 2017. Of course, he's formerly known as Jack Swagger, and he left the company because he felt that he wasn't being utilized correctly, and he requested his release.
Yeah, and he debuted in AEW in October 2019, and it was a big shock when he showed up out of nowhere on Dynamite. I don't think they've utilized his talent in AEW yet, but hopefully in the next few months, they'll get him into more great storylines and feuds, because in WWE, I think there was a lot of potential, but like in AEW, they just aren't utilizing that potential. Rusev, who now goes by Miro in AEW, was released by WWE in April 2020. Now talk a little bit about why exactly Rusev, who now goes by Miro in AEW, why was he released by WWE? Because he was a pretty big star.
Well, one of the main reasons why was obviously due to budget cuts last year, but there's some people in the know who believe that WWE wasn't happy with his attitude about the Lana-Bobby Lashley affair storyline.
He did not want to portray the bitter ex-husband. So he would come out there while Lana was having an affair with Lashley. He'd come out all smiles. He'd go high-fiving people because he just didn't want to play the bitter ex-husband.
Yes, and fast forward to AEW, joining AEW in September 2020, he ended up having a tag team with Kip Sabian, which lasted about 6 or 7 months, and recently the tag team broke up, and now Miro is going to become a singles wrestler, and he's going to go after the singles AEW titles.
Yes, and I think AEW realizes, and I think Miro realizes, that they just aren't using him right, because they've been using him as a comedy character since he entered the company. He came into the company because he was going to be the best man at Kip Sabian's wedding, a complete comedy gimmick, and they've completely misused Miro in AEW.
Yes, Miro so far has probably been the biggest flop when it comes to an ex-WWE wrestler going to AEW. FTR were released from WWE in April 2020. FTR was not happy in the company, so they were completely fine with getting released. And then FTR joined AEW in May 2020, and now they are members of the Pinnacle.
At first, they've had a lot of success, and there was a lot of buzz about them joining AEW, but now they've kind of been relegated to kind of being below the Young Bucks. You know, they aren't doing great right now, but they're doing better in AEW than they did in WWE.
Brian Cage actually wrestled for WWE Developmental, which back then was known as FCW. Many fans don't know this, and back then Brian Cage looked very different.
He parted ways with WWE in September 2009, and WWE had big plans for him, but for whatever reason, things just didn't work out, and he joined AEW in May 2020, and he's been featured a lot on Dynamite. He's probably on Dynamite almost every week. He fought Jon Moxley for the title, and he's had a lot of big matches. I think he's been utilized pretty well. Kenny Omega was actually in WWE Developmental, but he never made it to the main roster. He almost did become a WWE superstar, but he left WWE Developmental in August 2006. Now, why exactly did he not go to the WWE main roster?
Well, Kenny Omega was not happy in WWE Developmental because he felt that the developmental promotion, Deep South Wrestling, which he wrestled for, was run very poorly.
But then everything changed when he signed with AEW in January 2019, and everybody knows that WWE was trying to sign Kenny Omega because he was a huge hit in Japan, but unfortunately for WWE fans, he decided to sign with AEW instead. Right now, he's the AEW champion, and he's a top guy. Has Kenny Omega lived up to his potential in AEW?
I think now he is living up to his potential. I think before that he was being underutilized, but now that he's the champion, the top guy in AEW, he's being much better utilized.
Billy Gunn was released by WWE in November 2015. This happened after he tested positive for a banned substance when they tested him. He spent several years doing the independent circuit in wrestling, and then he was signed to AEW in January 2019.
But for the most part, he's there to help out his two young sons, who are a tag team in AEW, and he's basically their manager. The Big Show, who now goes by the name Paul White in AEW, left WWE in February 2021 and signed with AEW in March 2021.
so far, they've only utilized him mostly as a commentator for an AEW show that's on the internet, and he's only made maybe 1 or 2 appearances on Dynamite, but he has not wrestled yet. When do you think he's going to wrestle, if at all?
Well, the last time we saw Paul White was at the AEW Revolution pay-per-view during a backstage segment where he talked about the surprise that was going to happen on the show. But since then, there's been no discussion whatsoever of Paul White being on AEW Dynamite of any sort. Right now, he's just a commentator, but from what I understand, he will be wrestling at some point in 2021, and this could possibly happen when AEW starts having larger crowds and starts touring around the country for AEW Dynamite every week.
I think one of the reasons why Paul White decided to make the jump from WWE to AEW is because he did want to become a commentator, because he can't wrestle every week because he's getting up there in age, and he's a big guy and he's had a lot of surgeries, a lot of health issues, and being a commentator, it's a lot easier on his body, obviously, to just sit on a chair next to Tony Schiavone and call a match. He will do a few matches a year probably, so we will not see him wrestle every week, but we'll see him maybe 2 or 3 times a year wrestle either on Dynamite or on a pay-per-view.
Many fans don't know that Lance Archer once wrestled for WWE. He was known as Vance Archer in WWE's version of ECW. Eventually, he had a tag team with Kurt Hawkins on SmackDown. This was short-lived, and Lance Archer left the company in November 2010 after getting released.
So then, 10 years later, he signed with AEW in February 2020. Christian, who now goes by Christian Cage in AEW, officially left WWE in January 2021. He competed in the 2021 Royal Rumble, but then left the company and signed with AEW in March 2021. Of course, Christian Cage is the guy who was Paul White's big surprise. How do you think Christian Cage has done so far in AEW?
Well, I think it's been a pretty big disappointment so far. It's still wait and see, but I think Christian has been a disappointment. I think a lot of people were expecting CM Punk at the pay-per-view as the big surprise, or Brock Lesnar, and it ended up being Christian. So because of that, he's going to have to really prove himself, and it's going to take several months before that happens.
But because they raised the expectations so high to the level of CM Punk when it was Christian Cage, people were disappointed. And the fact now that he's kind of like just wrestling in random matches and he doesn't have a clear direction, like, is he going to fight for the world title soon? Is he going to fight for the TNT title? I'm not really sure what to expect from this AEW run out of Christian Cage.
Shawn Spears was formerly known as Ty Dillinger in WWE, and he was released in February 2019 from the company after requesting his release.
And then he signed with AEW in May 2019. This is one wrestler where I don't think there's going to be a lot of debate. He has not been used well in AEW. In fact, he's kind of been used as a glorified jobber.
Matt Hardy left WWE in February 2020 after his contract ran out.
And then he joined AEW in March 2020. And there was a lot of fanfare when Matt Hardy joined AEW because they had just done the angle where Randy Orton beat the heck out of him. And people loved it. They went over huge. But then, like the next week, Matt Hardy's contract ended and WWE decided not to renew it. So he went to AEW and then he kind of went nowhere. Now he's doing some kind of like $1 Million Man ripoff.
Yeah, right now, Matt Hardy, he's basically a glorified manager who wrestles occasionally, but at the same time, I think his main plan is to go back to the broken Matt Hardy character, which, honestly, even he said it himself, it failed because of the fact there were no fans in the building when he introduced the character to the AEW audience in March 2020.
And there's some characters that work just a lot better when there's a full crowd in the arena. And when Matt Hardy debuted, that was a time when there were 0 fans in the arena. Unfortunately, the broken Matt Hardy character in AEW didn't work. AEW star Pac was known as Neville in WWE. He left WWE in August 2018 due to a contract dispute.
Pac actually sat on the sidelines for over a year, waiting for WWE to release him from the company, but they refused. Eventually, they did release him, and a few months later, he signed with AEW. And so far in AEW, he's done relatively well compared to how he was used in WWE.
Colt Cabana left WWE in February 2009. Now, in WWE, he really wasn't that big of a star. He was kind of used as a jobber.
Yes, his name was Scotty Goldman. He was basically a jobber. He only wrestled a handful of times on SmackDown, and he was eventually released in February 2009, and Colt Cabana felt that WWE used him as a jobber as a way to bury him, because backstage officials supposedly didn't like him.
And Colt Cabana, he's one of those wrestlers that actually gained a lot more fame and fans after he left WWE because he started a podcast, he did the conventions, he did a lot of indie wrestling, and then he built up such a following that he signed with AEW in February 2020.
Cody Rhodes left WWE in May 2016. The reason why he left? Because he was forced to wrestle as Stardust, and the company wouldn't allow him to wrestle as Cody Rhodes.
And after he left WWE, he was able to build a huge following that eventually led to the creation of AEW. Now, one of the things I think that hurt him in AEW very early on was when he made the promise that if he lost to Chris Jericho in a championship match, that he would never be able to fight for the AEW championship ever again. I think that hurt him because, well, he can't fight for the world title, so what's the point?
Yes, that was actually a huge mistake that AEW officials made, was creating that stipulation, and since then, Cody Rhodes has had somewhat of a slow downfall. He's still heavily utilized on the show, and he is still one of the top stars in the company, but he's definitely not as big of a star as he used to be.
Right, and I think one of the problems is AEW does not want to be like WWE and go back on stipulations, meaning if somebody's fired from WWE, they're back in a couple months. If somebody says they can't fight for the title ever again, they're fighting for the title in a few months. Whereas AEW wants to be the anti-WWE and just say, we're never going to go back on our stipulations. And so far, they've followed through. But the only problem is, it's hurt Cody Rhodes in that process.
Also, Brandy Rhodes, Cody Rhodes' wife, was also in WWE as a ring announcer. Many fans don't know this, and Brandy left the company at the same time Cody left.
And she hasn't appeared that much on Dynamite, but one of the reasons why she hasn't as of late is because she's pregnant with her and Cody's first baby.
Trent, of the Best Friends, was released by WWE in January 2013, and then he joined AEW on February 7th, 2019.
Yeah, and one of the things that has gotten him over with fans is using his real-life mom to drop him off at matches in her minivan.
Rumor has it that another big-time WWE wrestler is getting ready to make the jump to AEW. Sasha Banks has not been seen very much since losing the SmackDown Women's Championship to Bianca Belair at WrestleMania 37. And now there are actually rumors that Sasha Banks might be signing with AEW at some point in the coming weeks.
Yeah, and when this rumor broke, a lot of fans were shocked. And right now, she's the #1 active female star on the WWE roster because obviously Becky Lynch is on the sideline. So losing her to AEW would be a major hit to the company, but it will help AEW, the women's division, because the women's division, I know people want to say don't judge it, don't criticize it, but let's face it, the women's division in AEW is not as big as the women's division in WWE, and having Sasha Banks join AEW will just make the women's division go to the moon.
Yeah, I think the women's division has gotten a lot better in AEW over the past few months, but they don't have that one gigantic star. And if Sasha Banks does join AEW in the coming weeks, they will have that big star.
And I think a great feud would be Sasha Banks versus Britt Baker. Just having those two over-the-top personalities feuding with each other, and they would have some really, I think, great matches. You know, if Sasha Banks truly is leaving WWE, I think you're going to have a lot of fans following her to AEW, and it's going to bring a whole new fan base to the company. So what are your thoughts on this breaking news that Sasha Banks could very well sign with AEW in the coming weeks? And do you think Jon Moxley, aka Dean Ambrose, made the right decision making the jump from WWE to AEW? Leave a comment and give us your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and be sure to click the bell notification so you are notified when we release our next video.